Stephen Miller is a clown. I've never seen that guy in real life, but he looks like he's like 4'10", and he looks like he is angry about the fact that he's 4'10", and he looks like he is so mad that he is 4'10", that he's taking that anger out at any other population possible. Like, laugh at them. Laugh at them.
419 seconds of silence, long enough to burn dinner, long enough to realize something has gone terribly wrong. And inside a congressional hearing, that silence didn't protect Stephen Miller, it exposed him. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez held up a contract tied to millions in taxpayer money and asked the one question no system built on profit ever wants answered: who got paid? And why won't you say it out loud? If you're new here, hit subscribe right now. Because what you're about to hear is not just about numbers, contracts, or policy. It's about whether a system designed to enforce the law quietly learned how to profit from the people it controls, and whether anyone inside that system is still willing to admit it. This is not a normal hearing. This is a controlled collapse of a narrative that had been carefully maintained for years, a moment where policy language stops working and raw accountability takes over, where one document, one signature, and one unanswered question begin to unravel something much bigger than a single official sitting at that table. The room that morning looked routine on the surface. Committee members seated, cameras fixed, staffers moving quietly. But underneath, something was already shifting, because when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked in carrying that thin manila folder, she wasn't preparing for a debate. She was preparing to introduce evidence, and evidence changes the rules of the room. For the first 30 minutes, Stephen Miller played it exactly as expected, delivering clean, rehearsed answers about border enforcement, operational demands, and national security priorities. And if you were just another viewer at home, you might have thought this was just another political exchange. But here's the first problem, and it matters more than it seems. When answers are too smooth, it usually means the real questions haven't been asked yet. And that's where the shift begins. Not in what was said, but in what hadn't been forced into the open. Because up to that point, the entire conversation was framed around necessity, around logistics, around the idea that detention was simply an unavoidable part of enforcement. But no one had yet asked the only question that actually tests a system's integrity. Who benefits when this system expands? Because here's the reality that most people don't think about until someone forces it into focus. When a policy generates money, it stops being just a policy. It becomes an incentive structure. And once incentives are involved, every decision inside that system starts to bend toward profit, not principle. And that's not a political opinion. That's basic human behavior. So when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez finally took the microphone and said, "Mr. Miller," it wasn't just a turn in speaking order. It was the moment the hearing stopped being informational and started becoming prosecutorial, because she wasn't about to ask how the system worked. She was about to show what the system was doing. She opened the folder slowly, deliberately, pulled out a single contract, and held it up just long enough for the cameras to lock onto it. And in that moment, everything that had been theoretical became documented. Because this wasn't a claim. It wasn't an accusation. It was a signed agreement, approved, authorized, and traceable. And here's the second problem, the one that should make any taxpayer pause, because what she read next wasn't complicated. It wasn't buried in legal jargon. It was clear, direct, and almost impossible to justify once you hear it in plain terms. $775 per person per day. Every individual detained, every single day, regardless of actual capacity. Now stop and think about that like a normal person. Not like someone inside a policy briefing, because this is where it stops being abstract and starts becoming real. Because if a system pays more when more people are detained, then the system has just been financially engineered to prefer more detention. And once that's true, everything else, every justification, every explanation, starts to sound a little different. And the question that follows isn't political, it's personal. If your tax dollars are funding a system like that, do you trust that system to act in your interest or in its own? Because once that number is on the record, $775 per person per day, the conversation can no longer hide behind policy language. It has to answer to reality, and reality has a way of stripping intent down to its simplest form. Who pays, who profits, and who gets trapped in between? Because systems don't just operate, they produce outcomes, and those outcomes always favor someone. So when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez didn't move on, didn't soften the question, and instead translated that number into something the public could actually feel, a family of 4 detained for 30 days, generating $93,000, she wasn't just explaining math, she was reframing the entire system as a revenue model, and that changes everything. And here's the third problem, the one that should make every viewer stop scrolling. Because once you turn human detention into a daily rate, you're no longer managing a crisis, you're managing inventory. And when inventory becomes profitable, expansion stops being a consequence and starts becoming a goal, whether anyone admits it or not. Now, watch what happens next, because this is where the hearing crosses a line that most never do, where data stops being defensive and starts becoming accusatory, because she doesn't just stop at the rate, she stacks the numbers, daily averages, total payments, hundreds of millions flowing through a single contract, and suddenly the scale becomes impossible to ignore. Over $2.2 million per day, flowing to a private contractor, over 6 months exceeding $400 million, and if you're sitting at home thinking that sounds like a system running on autopilot, you're missing the point, because money at that scale is never accidental. It is structured, approved, and sustained by deliberate choices made by people with names and signatures. And that brings us to the moment where the script breaks. Because when Stephen Miller tries to retreat into familiar language, operational costs, legal review, compliance frameworks, it doesn't land the way it usually does, because those words don't answer the question anymore. They just delay it. This is the exact moment a hearing turns into a trap, because repetition of process is not a defense against evidence of outcome. And every time he leans back on standards and procedures, the gap between what he's saying and what the numbers show gets wider, not smaller. And then comes the comparison, the kind that destroys comfort instantly. Because when she places the 2015 contract next to the current one, $298 versus $775, a 160% increase. She doesn't need to raise her voice. She just lets the contrast sit there, unanswered. And contrast is one of the most powerful forms of evidence because it doesn't argue, it exposes. Now think about that from the perspective of a citizen, not a policymaker, because this is where the trust question starts to crack. If conditions didn't improve, if facilities remained overcrowded, under-resourced, visibly strained, then what exactly justified the extra $477 per person per day? And that's not a rhetorical flourish. That's a structural contradiction, because in any system, increased funding is supposed to correlate with improved outcomes, and when it doesn't, the only remaining explanation is misallocation, inefficiency, or something far more intentional. So, when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduces the next layer, the corporate records, the timeline, the formation of Secure Borders Inc. just 2 months before the contract, you can feel the room tighten. Because now we're no longer talking about abstract policy or even inflated pricing. We're talking about proximity, about relationships, about who was positioned to benefit before the ink was even dry. And this is where the logic starts to close in. Because when a company appears just before a massive contract, when its leadership connects back to the same ecosystem making the decisions, and when the financial terms are unusually favorable, you don't need speculation. You have a pattern. And patterns in any investigative setting are where intent begins to reveal itself. So the question evolves, and it becomes sharper, more dangerous, impossible to deflect with prepared language, because it's no longer, how does the system work? It becomes, who inside this system is benefiting from the way it works? And once that question is asked on record, there are only 2 options left: answer it or refuse to. And both outcomes carry consequences. And that's the point where the room stops being a forum and starts becoming a test. Because once a direct question about financial benefit is placed on the record, silence is no longer neutral. It becomes a position, and every second without an answer begins to carry weight that no prepared statement can absorb. So when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez leans forward and asks, clearly, without decoration, who benefited financially from the $4.7 million, the hearing crosses into something far more dangerous than disagreement. It enters accountability, and accountability doesn't allow room for abstraction. At first, it looks like hesitation, the kind you expect when someone is searching for the right phrasing. But then 10 seconds pass, then 20, then 30, and nothing comes back. And that's when the atmosphere shifts, because people in the room, and people watching, start to realize this isn't a pause, this is a refusal forming in real time. Now understand why that matters, because in any legal or investigative setting, a simple denial is the lowest bar of defense. It requires no documents, no preparation, just a clear statement. No, I did not benefit. And the fact that even that baseline response doesn't appear immediately starts to raise a different kind of question, not about policy, but about risk. Because here's the fourth problem, the one that cuts deeper than any number on a page. When someone with direct authority over a contract cannot, or will not, deny personal benefit when asked plainly, it signals that the answer carries consequences beyond the room. Consequences that extend into records, relationships, and possibly legal exposure. And as the seconds continue to stack, 60, 90, past 100, the silence itself becomes evidence, not in the legal sense yet, but in the human sense, because people instinctively understand when someone is choosing not to speak. And that instinct is rooted in something simple. People stay quiet. When speaking is more dangerous than staying silent. The chairman eventually intervenes, prompting an answer. And when Stephen Miller finally speaks, it's not a denial. It's not even a clarification. It's a deflection, a statement about needing to review records, to consult, to verify, and in a normal context, that might be acceptable. But here, with his signature already on the contract, it lands as avoidance. And that's where the logic tightens again. Because if you authorized the structure, if your name is on the approval, then the distribution of funds is not an unknown variable. It is a direct consequence of a system you helped design. And claiming distance from that outcome doesn't resolve the question. It reinforces it. So when he ultimately declines to answer, on the advice of counsel, the shift becomes irreversible, because now the silence is no longer implied. It is declared, formalized, placed into the record, and once that happens, the hearing is no longer about extracting information. It is about documenting refusal. And think about what that means from the perspective of someone outside that room, someone paying into that system. Because this is where the gap between governance and public trust becomes visible. If officials can authorize hundreds of millions in spending, and then decline to explain who benefited, what exactly is the mechanism that ensures accountability? This is the moment where the narrative fractures, because the system presents itself as structured, regulated, compliant, but the behavior under pressure reveals something else entirely: uncertainty, hesitation, and a reluctance to attach clear answers to clear outcomes, and that contradiction is where confidence begins to erode. And as the reaction in the room escalates, voices rising, cameras shifting, the controlled environment breaking into something closer to confrontation, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez doesn't chase the noise. She doesn't need to, because the silence has already done the work. It has already created a gap that no argument can easily close. Because at the end of the day, the most powerful moment in that hearing wasn't a speech. It wasn't a statistic. It was a choice. The choice not to answer a direct question about money. And in any system that depends on public trust, that kind of choice doesn't just stay in the room. It follows the system wherever it goes. And then the silence stops being a moment and becomes a record. Because 419 seconds is not just a pause, it is time measured, documented, replayed, analyzed. And once something is measured like that inside a congressional hearing, it stops being subjective and starts becoming evidence of behavior under pressure. So when Stephen Miller pushes his chair back and leaves the room surrounded by attorneys, without answering who benefited from the money tied to a contract he personally signed, the story doesn't end there. It expands, because unanswered questions don't disappear. They multiply. They travel, and they begin to attach themselves to everything connected to that decision. And here is the fifth problem, the one that moves beyond a single contract and into the foundation of public trust. Because when a system allows massive financial flows, hundreds of millions of dollars, to be authorized without clear, transparent accountability for who ultimately benefits, it creates a structural blind spot, and blind spots in systems like this are where abuse doesn't just happen, it thrives. Because let's strip away the language and look at the reality in plain terms, the way any ordinary American would, sitting at home watching this unfold. Children detained, families processed, daily rates calculated, payments issued, and somewhere along that chain, profit is generated. And when asked directly who captured that profit, the answer is silence. That is not a partisan issue. That is not a policy disagreement. That is a moral fracture, because the moment human confinement becomes a line item that can be optimized for revenue, the system has already crossed a line that no legal framework alone can fix. And the longer that line remains unaddressed, the more normalized it becomes. And this is where the deeper meaning starts to surface, because what happened in that room is not just about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez pressing a witness. It is about testing whether the rules that govern ordinary citizens, disclosure, accountability, responsibility, still apply at the highest levels of decision-making, or whether those rules dissolve when enough money and influence are involved. Because think about the contrast. And this is where the moral weight lands hardest. If an average citizen mishandles public funds, there are immediate consequences, investigations, charges, accountability. But when someone in a position of authority is linked to a system that channels millions through a structure they approved, and they decline to answer basic questions about it, what message does that send about how evenly the law is applied? And that question doesn't stay inside Washington. It reaches into everyday life, into how people view taxes, institutions, enforcement, Because trust in a system is not built on what it promises when things are calm. It is built on how it behaves when it is challenged, when it is forced to explain itself under scrutiny. So what you witnessed was not just a confrontation, it was a stress test. And under that stress, the system revealed something uncomfortable. That transparency can be delayed, that accountability can be resisted, and that silence can be used as a shield when answers become dangerous. But silence is not resolution, and that is the final point. Because every unanswered question creates pressure, and pressure does one of two things. It forces disclosure, or it exposes the limits of the system's willingness to hold itself accountable. And right now, that pressure is still building. So here is the question that doesn't go away, the one that follows this hearing long after the cameras stop rolling. If a signed contract, documented payments, and a direct question cannot produce a clear answer about who benefited, then what exactly is the threshold for accountability?